Hey, let me check in with chapters, the introduction and chapters one to mostly three of The Club, um, by a, a nonfiction book of kind of literary biography, or just biography by Leo Damrosch, a 2019 book, which goes into a club that Samuel Johnson, Boswell, Joshua Reynolds, James, um, Edmund Burke, um, Adam Smith, and others all belong to, and was for kind of conversations and things like that. And it's really kind of a group of like the men of this age, the 1700s, 17s, ooh, 50s, 60s, something in there. I'll have to actually get my eras right. Where you know the great lexicographer, essayist, critic Samuel Johnson, um, and his the core of this seems to be the relationship between him and his biographer, the man who would become his biographer after his death, James Boswell, the great diarist and kind of gadfly who definitely pressed himself among upon a lot of famous men of his age, but never more so Samuel Johnson, who probably Johnson has to thank for his immortality, his grand immortality, with Boswell's biography of him, because it was probably the first of the modern biographies, even though I've actually read it. It took me a hell of a long time, but I read it, and it is one of these kind of weirdly misshapen beasts, which kind of skips over the majority of his life, to get to the point where Boswell actually hung out with him in the kind of the latter quarter, to be generous, of his life, and is filled with lots of basically repurposed Boswell diary entries of his conversation, but it captures that conversation and all his bon mots and all that stuff, which he probably comes off better in some ways in that biography than he does in his own writings. For my ignoramus thing, I've yet to being able to kind of crack reading um, Johnson's Johnson's essays, and indeed that might be something I want to try later. But so we're starting off here of it's like Johnson early life. It starts off with, and then Johnson's fame, and then Johnson before Boswell, and then Boswell's early life, uh, Boswell's London, Boswell's journals, all leading up to when this group gets together, which apparently Boswell, who is considered definitely the lightweight, like why would we have this guy in our group, was kind of Johnson kind of prevails upon the rest to allow him admittance, where indeed he is probably what you would consider um, the great note taker, but like somebody with amazing chops. That's the one thing about the book that I would notice so far is like poor Johnson is getting kind of a kicking as um, a manic depressive, egotistical horror guy who hung out with prostitutes and then felt bad about it. Um, Not really interested in the women in Johnson's life, and leaving them out of the biography, kind of bit of the misogyny there. Um, he's getting kicking, even though he is probably the first and one of the great biographers, with the great subject of Johnson brought to life. There's a reason why his book has lasted all the way through these ages. Um, so yeah. Though I do actually enjoy Leo Damaros talking about Johnson and including a lot of those female voices and female friendships. He calls it the Shadow Club of all the women that he knew and had, actually rich, respectful, interesting relationships with. Um, you know, whether it's his wife, his first wife and his first and only wife, I can't remember, and just all the women, Miss Thrale and stuff like that that he knew. It's interesting there. So yeah, that's what I'm starting off with. It's good to remind yourself, like, oh, Johnson, he's kind of the titan, one of these dead old white males, but he's somebody who was poor, somebody who was seemed to have what looked like um, kind of either Tourette's or something like that, or and have like obsessive compulsive disorder, and had a terrible birth, which seems to have severed nerves in his eye, had a kind of had kind of weird growth on his neck as an infant, that was a big massive guy, 6 feet tall, which was very tall for the time, but you know was somebody who was desperately poor, um, who probably kind of flopped down in houses, was a Grub Street writer, basically just writing for money, scrounging and all this stuff. It's not exactly what you would consider one of these people who would actually rise through the dint of his intellect to the high points of the thing. Um, Finally ending up in the latter part of his life, getting a pension for maybe for past contributions, maybe because the government of the time actually wanted him to write for them, and he did apparently write a bit for them. Um, but you know, who it's kind of interesting that way. And I mean, Johnson seems to have been somebody who had manic, who not Johnson was definitely had clinical depression, and Boswell was probably manic depressive, with definitely running in his family and having the great misfortune of having a fucking bastard father who had zero sympathy for it, whether for him or for another brother who was like, had to live with a doctor. He was so incapacitated. Um, yeah, yeah. So it's like people who, it's like, all the good old days when men were men and really fucking suffered so much. It's just like brutal. All right, I will leave it there. Interesting stuff. Definitely conjuring an era, stinking, brutal. God, the stagecoach ride from Scotland to England on with no shock absorbers on hard benches. If you were lucky inside, or sitting up top, which was even more dangerous on benches. It's like, holy shit. Yeah. Not an era I would want to have been lived in, but it's really interesting to read about.